Did you hear that magical voice saying recording in progress?
That's great.
Yeah.
Morning, Kev.
Well, hello. Good morning, Sandra and John. Am I Sandra or Sandra?
Sandra.
I don't hear the difference, to be honest. I say, if you want to say it in French, it's Sandra.
Sandra.
Great. Just what we needed, a third pronunciation. Today's podcast may include strong language and adult themes. Let's just see what the next half hour holds. Hello and welcome to Comic Cuts, the panel show. My name's Kev F Sutherland. You might know me as a writer and artist for Beano, Marvel Comics, Oink, Doctor Who, the Scottish Falsetto Sock Puppet Theatre, and my graphic novel adaptations of Shakespeare. But chances are you probably don't. My guests today talking comics are Sandra Mars and John Chalmers, aka Metaphrog.
Hello.
Good morning, Kevin. Thanks.
And now, brace yourselves. I'm going to do the theme tune, which I perform live.
Wow.
You say wow now. Comic Cuts. We're looking at a panel and we comprise a panel. There's a few of us. So the panel seats a panel and we talk about the comics from the panel we discuss and we call it Comic Cuts.
Amazing.
Well done. Well done. That's a wrap.
In so many ways. I have two guests with me today who brought with them a panel from a comic or something close. We're going to see if we can identify it and talk about it. Maybe we and you will learn something about comics we didn't already know, or maybe we'll just show off a bit and have an enjoyable chat. Let's see. And it's an unusual situation today because usually I have two separate and diverse people in different parts of the country or different parts of the world. Today, both from Glasgow and both sitting side by side, shoulder to shoulder, our husband and wife team, Metaphrog. Good morning.
Good morning. We're not husband and wives. Actually, we're together. We live together, but we're not actually married.
Are we not?
Did you not know?
I didn't realise. You learn something every day.
Is that a common misconception? Because I must admit, I just automatically thought you were married. Then again, I am very old.
We're also quite common law, I guess, is the Scottish term, because we've been living together for 27 years.
How did you come together? Through comics?
No, actually, we didn't make comics before we met. Actually, we started making comics because we met. I moved from France when I was in my early 20s. And so I moved to Glasgow. And within a month, I met John just purely by chance, basically.
I think we probably did make comics when we were 4, 5, 7, you know, when we were young, both of us, but not together. I was also still in my 20s, but when Sandra says early 20s, she means literally 20. I met her just before her 21st birthday. And I was in my late 20s, so I was nearly 30. But we've been making comics since we met, which is quite unusual, because I was working in science and engineering before that.
Well, that's
and
right.
Meeting Sandra kind of gave me the courage to become a writer. I think.
So what sort of comics had you individually been making before you came together?
Like comics with crayons and bits of paper. I had characters called Mutt and Jeff, things like that.
I've got to say, Mutt and Jeff, not entirely original.
No. But then I was writing songs that I probably heard on the radio as well, like all mad young kids, you know.
I copied Tintin comics.
Copied.
I mean, I think both of these things are what kids do. A lot of kids who make comics are also making music and making other art, and a lot of people are copying comics, aren't they?
Yeah,
I think so. Yeah,
you get inspired by what you read, so you try to do it.
Yeah, very much. Sandra,
it's very puzzling to most of us that you would come from France to Glasgow. Why?
That's what most people said when they met me. But they were like, "Why are you coming from France to Glasgow? It should be the other way around." I really wanted to travel and to live abroad, and Glasgow just happened to be the place that I ended up. It could have been anywhere else, I guess, because I knew people there, and so I thought, well, I'm just going to go there and try it. And
it was nearly Mexico.
Yeah, it could have been Mexico, it could have been Spain, but it was Glasgow. But I love the city. I found it like super full of energy, and I just loved it.
Very vibrant place.
Well, Glasgow's also got a great comics tradition, hasn't it? A lot of creators of a very high status, especially over the years, have come from Glasgow and Scotland. I mean, slightly because of DC Thompson, I guess, but also just a wellspring of talent.
That's right. Well,
That's true.
Vincent Frank Whiteley is notably not from Glasgow per se, but just outside of it.
And Grant Morrison.
Oh yeah, that's right. And Mark Miller.
Mark Miller, they're quite big names in comics. And well, I guess Dundee's seen as the epicenter in comics. I think growing up, when I read Oor Willie and the Bruins and the Beano and the Dandy and maybe Spider-Man and Superman comics and Batman comics, I had no idea who the creators were. A lot of them were Scottish.
Well, that's right. Anonymity in comics was very much the order of the day with the British comics we were reading. And apart from Tintin, were you reading newer BD, Sandra?
As a child, you mean?
Yeah.
There were actually older comics which nobody's heard of in Britain. And I don't even have copies of it anymore. I don't even know if people remember these comics. They were called Sylvain and Sylvette. I think that was for early readers. I read a few Asterix. I wasn't quite so much into that. But no, I think that was about it. Then I kind of stopped reading comics from the age of maybe 11, 12, and I only rediscovered them when I was about 16 or something.
Do you feel in touch with the French scene at all, or is it just as far away from you as it is from us based in the UK?
Well, because I've been going to France less and less often, I must admit that I've kind of lost touch a little bit with France and with what's happening there in terms of comics.
We've been invited to Angoulême. We've been involved with French comics. We went to Angoulême for a good dozen years in a row.
Really?
From 1997 onwards.
Under your own steam or with the publisher?
Under our own steam. We did everything under our own steam. We just had a kind of mad impulse.
Mad obsession.
We worked all the time. We made our comics. We went to see people to talk about comics. It was just our life. We just made it our life. It's very enjoyable.
I mean, comics is obsessional like that, isn't it? For anybody who's not been to Angoulême, and this includes me, can you describe it, especially for people who've only been to a British comic convention, which might be in a sports hall?
Well, it's basically a British comic convention times 10,000. It's pretty amazing. It's full of people. It's hugely inspiring. There's lots of exhibitions and talks, and it's, I guess, less centered towards the stand kind of sell your own comics kind of thing. There are publishers exhibiting in stands, but it's all about the activities that are around these things. So exhibitions, yeah, a lot of talks, and also there's lots of school kids that go to it in the tens of thousands, I think.
There's 250,000 plus 250,000, and although it's changed over the years, it's still very vibrant and exciting and vital. I think it's also centred around the Museum of Bande Dessinée, the Comic Museum in Angoulême, which is fantastic. It's got original pages by Hergé, for example. And the exhibitions, they often originally had original art. Maybe that's changed a little bit now as things have progressed, but they were very inspiring. It's also quite exhausting. Over a very short period of time, you meet thousands of people. And they're all quite similar to you, because you can't meet many people with much more in common with you.
It sounds much closer to Glastonbury or the Edinburgh Festival than to any British comic festival that I think any of us have seen.
Yeah.
It's more akin to the Edinburgh Festival, I think. Yeah, it's more like a cultural event. I think recognising the fact that in France comics are seen as a ninth art, I think it's really legitimate to say that it's kind of like a broad cultural event.
Comics as the ninth art is always fascinating. I mean, seeing how seriously the French take it. Has anybody ever successfully named all other 8?
Big challenge.
You're going to start dancing about architecture, aren't you?
I think it's like naming the 7 dwarves. You think, oh, obvious. But what have we got? We've got painting, we've got sculpture, we've got literature, I suppose. Ballet, poetry, I'm only up to 5.
Film.
Cinema, yes.
Cinema, 6.
Did you say dance?
I've already uncovered dance, yeah. I mean, I don't know if there's a separate category for street dance and one for ballet. This could be.
I think it's just dance. I think maybe architecture.
He said
Of course. Oh, no, you didn't say architecture. You said dancing about architecture, which is a quote from, is that Le Corbusier? I can't remember.
I think so, yeah. And then Elvis Costello.
Oh, I love it when we manage to get Elvis Costello and Le Corbusier in one sentence. That's in many ways the aim of this podcast. Is your work published in France, in French?
Some of it is. The book that we contributed to for Dark Horse, it's published in French and Spanish. We did try and translate our stuff, but it's quite difficult. You didn't remember that, did you?
No, I thought it was just Spanish.
Spanish, Italian, French.
Maybe.
I mean, given that one of you is already equipped to translate into French, I think you've got a head start, haven't you?
Sort of. Do you know, I'm losing my French. Actually, I was just saying to John yesterday that I have major issues with spelling in French now, and I spell much better in English than in French, whereas obviously when I moved, I was very good at it, but now I've lost it.
Also, I think people just assume that if you're good at translating or if you're a native speaker, then it's not an issue. But you lose associations, you lose connotations, you lose something, definitely. You may gain other things, but there are some words which just don't translate with the same associations. It's actually a very difficult thing to do.
Yeah, I would imagine so. Talking of changing the subject, your award winners. The winner of the Scottish Culture Awards for Best Visual Artist. That's a bit of an accolade, isn't it?
That was a moment to be completely gobsmacked. I usually talk for Scotland, but I completely was utterly gobsmacked.
It was unexpected.
Put it mildly. It was lovely. It's a really good recognition. But I think we've seen in a visual culture comics growing in stature. Maybe ninth art's still somewhere along the road, but it's certainly recognised. A lot of people pick up graphic novels the way they watch films, with a serious intention.
Well, also kids. Sometimes a lot of comic creators overlook kids because they want to do grown-up material, and they sometimes think that means making material that only grown-ups are allowed to read. But you've never let kids be left behind by your work, have you?
No, it's always been aimed for humans. I think it's all ages, yeah, all ages.
And you're adapting classic stories. Now, that's an interesting starting point, which chimes with me because I've been adapting Shakespeare into my recent graphic novels. And you've got The Little Mermaid, Bluebeard, and
the Red Shoes.
The Red Shoes looks at notes. Yes, now that's an interesting starting point. What made you lead towards those stories?
That was an interesting thing, actually, because we were working on commissions, and at the time that we started developing a couple of short stories, and we did that just to enter a couple of competitions. And one of them was an adaptation of The Little Match Girl. And then we didn't win the competitions, but we made the mini comic out of the short stories and sent it around to people that we'd met in the industry. And one of them happened to be Terry Nantier at NBM. And to our huge surprise, he actually got back to us within a few days and said he'd loved it and asked us if we'd be interested in creating a collection for them. So that was the start of our adaptations.
We'd made our own Louis books for more than a decade. We made 5 different stories. And Sandra redid the first Louis book, so there were 6 books, 5 different stories. And they're informed by classic literature, by nonsense verse, by ideas, that are broad human ideas. But I think you'd reached a saturation point. You'd made enough Louis books by that point. It's a lot of work. And at that point that we reached, we thought, well, we need to get a publisher. We're just doing too much as well as the creative work. But also it meant it allowed us to rethink our creative process and change direction a little bit. So that was probably 2011, 2012, something like that.
The Red Shoes came out in 2015, and we worked on it 2 years prior to that.
And one of the great strengths of Louis is the ability to tell stories silently. Now, that's a really, really hard thing to do that most people avoid. Did you find many pitfalls in trying to tell stories without words?
I think you need a lot more pages to do that, because putting words obviously saves a lot on the drawing side. So
yeah, I mean, I think Strange Weather Lately was like a catharsis. There was a lot of words. It was more like an illustrated novel. But Louis wanted to make something that was for all ages, genuinely. And to do that, we felt that needed an economy of language. We also wanted to create something quite artificial. So there's an element of poetic language that you wouldn't normally find. We also wanted to make people laugh. And to be quite honest, I think we were hugely influenced by Tintin. We've been rereading Tintin over the last few months, on and off, and realizing just how much it's driven by action. There's a colossal momentum in the stories. It's like watching a Fritz Lang film, like the Dr. Mabuse films. The Mabuse films, they're kind of relentless action. They might be old and they might be quite long, but it's like almost uplifting to watch because it's like so euphoric. It's like a thriller. So we wanted to have a momentum to the page turning. Does that make sense?
I've asked everyone on the panel to bring a panel to the panel. You'll be able to see the images that we're about to look at on my website at kevfcomicartist.com, and they should be on the artwork for the podcast episode, depending where you get your podcasts from. But don't worry if you can't see the images, because we're going to describe them. And we're going to begin by having a look at Sandra's panel. Okay, can you guys see that filling your screen?
Yes.
Yes.
You can now.
Now, usually I get the other guest who's never seen this picture to describe it, and they have no idea what they're looking at. John, I'm assuming you have seen Sandra's Choice before.
Yes, I have, yes.
Okay, it's left then to me to have a guess at what we've seen. This is totally unfamiliar to me. So, listener at home, you shouldn't need to see this. Let's see how well I can sum this up. We are looking at a large square picture. It could be the whole of a square page, but it could, I think, be 2/3 of a page. I mean, it might not be, but the size of the text makes me suggests to me it is that big a picture. We are seeing a train receding into a distance, going over a bridge, which is going over a viaduct, bridging a valley. There is a woman looking out of the window of this train. We're in sepia colors, as is she. She is young looking. She has large eyes, scared eyes. It's a semi-realistic style, not totally realistic though. She has cartoon big round eyes. The train receding into the distance is old and it's pulled by a steam engine, making clouds of steam into the smoke, which suggests to us that we are in the past, as does the coloring, as does the text, which says we all knew what a call up from the Nazi SS meant, but I also knew father would never let it happen. So we are in the 1930s or the Second World War, and this person going off on the train has got slightly ghostly figures surrounding her in the carriage. We can't see many of the faces, but the ones we can see are just black holes in ghostly white-shaped faces. So I fear that we could be looking at a story connected to the Holocaust. I'm even looking at the face of that person, thinking that it could be, and this is where my guess is coming from, it could be Anne Frank. Are we looking at the Diary of Anne Frank?
You are. You totally are.
Genuinely a guess. I haven't Googled it. And you know what? I'm not going to Google, even though I could. Nobody listening would know, but I'm not going to Google. Okay, Sandra, tell me what this is from.
Well, I could have chosen a different panel from this graphic novel, which would have been less obvious. Obviously, the text here mentioning the Nazi SS was kind of a giveaway. So this is the Anne Frank's diary graphic novel adaptation. And I think it came out just a few years ago, and it was adapted by Ari Folman and David Polonsky, who are also responsible for the animated film, The Waltz of Bashir. And I just loved this adaptation. I'd read the Diary of Anne Frank, the book, actually quite late on in life. I read it when I turned 40. But this adaptation is just, it's totally amazing. And this panel in particular, when I saw it, I just thought, I'm just going to have to reread this book. It's just so well done. Everything
in the panel, you described it incredibly well, Kev. I think that's the eye and descriptive qualities of a cartoonist right there.
And you were right, it's 2/3 of a page, bang on.
It is 2/3 of a page, but
And those colours, I didn't describe the red sky, but it's like the train is driving off into not a romantic sunset, but a furnace. There's even a shape in the rock on the far hillside, which is like a factory chimney, suggesting something that lies ahead. And the little heart of red surrounded by black cloud. I mean, it's not too literal. I may be making it sound awfully like it's an almost cliche or overcooked description of what's coming. It's not. It's just foreboding.
Well, this shape of the chimney that you just described, I totally didn't notice that, but that's another detail about this picture that is amazing. I like that it described, like, just visually, if you just look, if you took off the text, this picture tells a story in itself. So you get the train driving in the distance and the sky is red, and that suggests basically death, as you said, the furnace. And I like that the black smoke is coming off the train, and that suggests like the chimney coming out of the concentration camp chimneys. I like that the train is like driving over an abyss, and also like the phantom like faces inside the train, like the people are reduced to being they've been dehumanized basically, and the only face that is recognizable is Anne Frank's face.
How does this color scheme match up with the rest of the book? It's not all done sepia and these colors, is it?
No, it's not. There's quite a lot of bright pastel colors, if that makes it sounds like it's an oxymoron, but yes, there's some nice greens and nice oranges. It's very, very well colored, actually. That's what I loved about the book the most, I think. It's the coloring, and it's not actually done by the person who illustrated it. An interesting thing about this book is that it's done by a team. So apparently the colors done by a different person, but also the storyboards are done by someone else again. So
when you say storyboards, do you mean the panel drawings or the layouts that the artists work to?
Well, it refers to it in the notes at the end of the book as storyboard. So I'm assuming that they're meaning the layout or the thumbnails.
Right. Yeah. It's the same team in part that did Waltz with Bashir, the film. So their usage of the term storyboards is probably more appropriate to film as an art form. You and I, or Sandra and I, would call it breakdowns, thumbnails, layout pages.
Well, yeah, I think it's only fair that there are so many different approaches to comics. There could be as many different approaches as there are comics. Some people get dogmatic about the way things have to be done and strict and rigid processes, but of course that's ridiculous. You need to end up with the result that you're envisaging, whatever road takes you there.
Yeah.
I think the great thing about this book, considering that it's made by a team of different people, is that it's so the end product is just perfect. It's very cohesive, and it's as if it had been done by just one person.
I think it's faithful to Anne Frank's diary tone as well, which I reread after Sandra read it, and I'd read it as a child. We also went to Amsterdam and visited Anne Frank's house. I think it's a very profound story. It's also quite humorous, quite light, given the depth of subject and the darkness that's there in the background. It's still quite a light story. Yeah,
the graphic novel adaptation really brings out the humor in Anne Frank's diary, which I'm assuming there's some kind of lightheartedness to the original material, but the comic version is very comic.
An adaptation of something like this is rather difficult when you know how the story is going to pan out. Of course, Anne Frank, writing her diary, doesn't know what's going to happen. She realized these things are getting worse and worse, but she's still a 15-year-old child for most of it. I think I'm right.
Yeah, that's right.
I think she's a bit younger at the start. It spans a couple of years, I think. So
right,
spans a few years, but she's quite like forceful. She's got a unique voice, and it's quite a humorous tone, quite a literary tone. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a classic. That's been retained. So the initial story's humor, the original story's humor, permeates the graphic novel. It's not inappropriate in every sense. It's a counterbalance to the tragedy.
And comics as a collaborative effort are an interesting thing to look at, because you two work together. And American comics, we're very used to the Marvel method and their conveyor belt of production. And then in Europe, there's much more of a tradition of the author's voice, a writer and artist, and the complete product being the work of one person. But is one necessarily better than another?
I don't know. I think it can work in any combination. I guess if there's a team involved, then they have to be really kind of on the same page for it to work.
Sympathetic.
Yeah, I think they've got to really work as a team. I think I recently read of projects that were, I couldn't say which ones exactly, but where like the story is written, then it's passed down to the thumbnails and then passed down to the penciler and then so on and so forth. And nobody really communicates. So I can imagine that the end product of that would be maybe not as good. I don't know.
If you read something like Jack Kirby, it's seen as American comics, but it's of one piece. Kirby's voice comes through and his ideas are there and it's forceful and it's exciting storytelling. I think it comes down to dissolution of ego in service to the story. So if you have a good group of people who are sympathetic and understand the story is the important thing. The end result, as you mentioned earlier, how you get there is almost irrelevant if you can produce something that's of high artistic quality.
Excellent. Well, thank you for the Diary of Anne Frank. I think it's time to see just how cheerful John's suggestion is. Is that quite big on your screen?
Quite big.
Yep.
Quite good.
Listener at home, you'll find this on the podcast artwork wherever you get your podcasts from, or go to the website. I can't ask Sandra to describe it because she's seen it before, haven't you?
Yes, I have.
Which means it's down to me to describe. We are looking at a black and white line drawing intended to be printed in black and white, I would say. A figure is walking along Lower Manhattan. I think I'm right that it's Manhattan, aren't I? I think I know it's Manhattan because we had the map of Manhattan on the wall of our lounge for maybe 10 years with one of those orthographic projection maps that you get in New York, probably in the shop at the Empire State Building. And we framed it and stuck it up on the wall and it was there for years. So I'm pretty sure we're looking at Manhattan. That's the East River over there. That's City Harbor there and the South Street Seaport Pier sticking out there, as seen in the background of the YMCA video. Not interesting, but true. Now, there is a figure walking across this actual map. So the figure is drawn on top of an actual reproduction of a map. And the figure looks, I would say, manga style in the line work, in the tones that are put on this guy's jacket. It's a man, student age or in his 20s. He's got black hair swept across neatly in a hairstyle that you'd see from the 20th century, but before usually the 1960s, carrying a textbook. So that's what makes you think that this person is a student. It might not be a textbook, but it looks like a textbook. He's got shiny shoes as well, open-necked shirt, and there's no dialogue at all. No thought bubbles, no captions, no nothing apart from the person walking across the map. The sort of image that might be used in the same way as you'd use a montage in a film, suggesting a passage of time, a passage from one story beat to another story beat, or the guy's just arrived in New York, he's acquainting himself with New York, and for some reason the south side of Manhattan would be the part he's equating himself with. Depending, of course, what time in the 20th century it is, the nature of that part of town would have changed. And I'm thinking that this is the time around the 1930s and the Second World War again, I think. I have no idea what book this is from, though, and I can't even guess. So I'm going to have to ask you to tell me. Oh, unless it is... No. But I know Barefoot Jen is a book set around the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but I don't think this is that. So tell us, please, John, what is it?
It was not actually a manga. It's an adaptation of one of Paul Auster's short stories.
Oh man, New York Stories by Paul Auster. I've read those. No. Me saying I've read a book is actually, you've got a small field to choose from.
Well, this is an adaptation of the first of the 3 short stories in the New York Trilogy, and it's called City of Glass. And the adaptation was done by Paul Karasik and David Mazzucchelli.
David Mazzucchelli, that name sprung to mind because David Mazzucchelli's Batman Year One is one of the texts that readers of my vintage devoured in the 1980s. And his line work, which is very realistic. I actually interviewed David Mazzucchelli on stage at the comic convention. Maybe it was one of the ones in Glasgow, maybe the ones in London. And I had him on at the same time as John Romita Jr. And I suggested to David Mazzucchelli that did he possibly work from photo reference because his drawings were so realistic. John Romita Jr. immediately picked up on the fact that I hadn't accused him of that.
Different styles.
I was perhaps favouring one person's draftsmanship. David Mazzucchelli, adaptation of Paul Auster's New York Stories. Oh, tell me more.
Well, this is City of Glass, and the reason I chose it is because I think it's a rarity. It's one of these works of art that adds to the original. I think you could argue the same of Saundra's choice, because the graphic novel certainly adds something to Anne Frank's diary, although Anne Frank's diary is incredible in and of its own right. But this is one where the themes of language and identity are interrogated, and it works very, very well. So the drawing style changes occasionally throughout the book. There's different little effects and different little ideas that are encapsulated in the drawing style itself. So it's using the comic medium to add to the themes and ideas that are inherent in the City of Glass story. New York Trilogy's 3 slightly related short stories, and this is the first one. It was published by Neon Lit, which are Art Spiegelman's imprint. So you can sense Spiegelman's intelligence and guiding hand behind this. It's an incredible piece of work. Very, very quick read, and it's been reissued recently. There's loads of ideas like a fingerprint, zooming in on a fingerprint, zooming out, and it becomes a maze. Ideas about language. The characters in the book are having a tough time. All of them seem to be having some kind of breakdown or other. One of the characters has kept their son locked away in the hope that they'll utter the language of God, whatever that means. So it's interrogating ideas of language and identity. And so it looks at representation. So right away, you've got that encapsulated in this page. This is page 101. And the man walking on the map, he's not visiting, but in a way he is, because he's kind of lost. So it's got all these ideas about loss, alienation, identity.
Am I right in remembering that he traces some sort of image through the route he makes?
Traces letters. He's basically lost. He's looking for false meaning. Paul Auster's in the book, as you know. He's in his short story. He's also in this, and it is Paul and his wife Siri Hustvedt and their child. And there's a bit in it where our main character visits the Auster family, and it's as if the Auster, by offering him a beer and by being happy and contented and having a child, is mocking him because he's lost all these things. And he gets cartoon harpooned, which is another very effective image, which we almost chose.
Yeah, that's another book that you could have chosen an infinite amount of panels from, because it's a complete treasure trove in terms of what David Mazzucchelli does with the graphic novel form. It's just amazing. I would recommend anyone read it just for what you can actually do with the comic format.
Playing with the 9-panel grids, making it almost like a prison, playing with the speech bubbles, second guessing the reading. It's just so much in it. You can read it. I guess you'd read it an infinite number of times. It's an incredible little book.
Well, yes, looking at this map, you're looking at the grid of New York, and New York's street grids immediately, for someone like ourselves, are suggesting the grids of comic strip pages.
Yeah, that's right. So there's all these meta levels, and I know that makes it sound terribly dry, but above all, it's very entertaining and rewarding read.
Adaptations from one form into another are something that you and I have both dabbled in. I've been doing the Shakespeare plays and then making them into slightly different graphic novels, changing the story slightly, but also taking advantage of the graphic novel form. And you, of course, have taken, ancient stories, sort of stories that were passed on by mouth or by Hans Christian Andersen. It's an interesting thing, the adaptation, isn't it?
I think it really is. We were very attracted to these stories. As children, we read them and got horripilation. We got like our hair standing on end and our skin standing on end, reading them. Very, very exciting. They tell us about ourselves, tell us about others. And I think as stories, they're quite basic, like they're stories that we can relate to, transformations, the terror of a potentially murderous husband. I think Sandra brought an awful lot to the visual storytelling in Bluebeard. The ideas there, they can be crossed over to film, for example, the visual storytelling ideas, but they work best in comics with the double page and the impact of the reading.
Well, see, this is very interesting, looking at New York Stories and looking also at Anne Frank earlier. They're shorter books. And the problem with adapting to comics is comics take up more space. So if you were to adapt a 250-page novel into a comic book, you either have to pick and choose, or you have to end up with a, 600-page comic book?
Yeah.
That's exactly what the authors of the Anne Frank diary adaptation say in their notes at the end of the book. They said that if they had kept the integrity of Anne Frank's text, it would have ended up being a 3,500-page graphic novel. Mm-hmm. And obviously that's not a goer. So what they did is to summarize a lot of the chapters that she wrote.
I must admit, I'm hard pressed to think of many novels or short stories adapted to comic books. There's probably thousands, but they're not springing to mind. Because when I was growing up, the equivalent, or the only attempts being done, were Classics Illustrated. Marvel did a whole line of the Classics Illustrated, taking things. I've got Homer's Odyssey and the Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde adapted into comics, but they were so truncated as to be almost a skim through the book, squeezed down into about 30 or 40 pages. It doesn't really adapt so much as survey.
Well, when Edinburgh was the UNESCO City of Literature, Alan Grant and Cam Kennedy adapted Dr. Jekyll, Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And there are other attempts or other essays on that same book. We can think of a few. Some of them transfer it to Nazi Germany even. I think it does fascinate people. That's a great novella. That's one of the best pieces of Scottish literature. Robert Louis Stevenson's work is extraordinary.
Again, a novella. So we've got a short enough inspiration to work with and then make it your own thing. Yes, Alan Grant and Cam Kennedy's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and also They're Kidnapped.
That's right.
Splendid books. But those are for another podcast. Here, we're still looking at Paul Auster's adaptation, drawn by David Mazzucchelli, written by whom?
Paul Karasik. Paul Karasik was an editor with Art Spiegelman and Françoise Mouly on Raw. And I think the intelligence brought to it is very telling because it reads seamlessly. It's not losing anything in the adaptation, it's actually gaining, which we found really unusual. It's actually weird that we both chose adaptations.
Yeah, that was not
intentional.
Not intentional.
That is magnificent. I'm going to pause just so that I can get the correct names here. The Diary of Anne Frank by Ari Furman, is it?
It's an unusual name. It's Ari Folman, A-R-I. Mm-hmm. New word F-O-L-M-A-N. And illustrations are by David Polonsky, P-O-L-O-N-S-K-Y.
Polonsky, who also did The Waltz of Bashir. And New York Stories, drawn by David Mazzucchelli, written by Paul...
City of Glass. So it's called Paul Auster's City of Glass.
Oh,
and
right.
The adaptation is by Paul Karasik, K-A-R-A-S-I-K, and illustrated, of course, by David Mazzucchelli, M-A-Z-Z-U-C-C-H-E-L-L-I.
Great. I'm just going to back...
Series designer, Art Spiegelman.
So Art Spiegelman's involvement there. We're big fans of Raw, and I think also of the people who came out of Raw in many ways, like Richard Maguire and Chris Ware, and I guess in a way Daniel Klaus, and obviously Joe Sacco. A lot of these cartoonists are creating really interesting work in the field.
The 1980s truly was a golden age, a paradigm shift in what comics thought they could do and then went on to do, wasn't it?
Very much. Yeah. You're thinking also of like Alan Moore's From Hell and things like that?
Well, yes, a number of 1980s things have come up in these podcasts, actually. But yeah, first time that Raw and Art Spiegelman and all the people who came from there and New York in the 1980s has come up. Well, thank you to Sandra Mars and John Chalmers, aka Metaphrog. We've been looking at The Diary of Anne Frank, as adapted by Ari Folman and David Polonsky. And we have been looking at City of Glass. That's Paul Auster's City of Glass, as adapted by Paul Karaski and David Mazzucchelli. If you have any questions for us, you can find us at our social media. Guys, where do we find you on the socials?
You can find us on Twitter at Metaphrog and on Facebook.
Metaphrog graphic novels.
That's right. And also on Instagram.
It's crazy. You're on all the platforms.
And I'm on Twitter at Kev F Comic Artist and at kevfcomicartist.com. Please click subscribe to be sure of hearing every episode when it comes out, and leave us a review, why don't you? Thanks again to Sandra and John, and to you for listening. I've been Kev F, and this has been Comic Cuts, the panel show. And we're out.
Cool.
Thank you so much. That was great.
That was really quick.
Goes fast.
It's a half-hour show. We've recorded about 35 minutes. So, oh yeah. Oh, that's interesting format. So it's more.
It's a book format, yeah.
Yeah, paperback. This is the size that I've been working as well.
Okay.
Because self-publishing, you can do 120, 180 pages and make it affordable to people, which is the only way I could do it.
Yeah.
Anne Frank's diary is similar size?
No,
it's much bigger.
It's bigger, right? Yeah.
Bigger.
There's no hand. This is a hand-sized book.
Pocket book.
I don't have giant hands. It's just a normal, enormous hand, like the hand of King Kong.
So a wonderful cartoon somebody posted on Facebook just yesterday of the unseen shot of King Kong. You see King Kong climbing up the skyscraper, and the next picture, some guys having an office meeting in an office, turning around, and there's just a big willy at the window.
Always funny. Always funny. Never figured out why they're always funny, but there you are.
Fabulous. Well, thank you. I shall trim this down to half an hour, and it will be July, I think, before it hits the air, and I'll tell you when and where.
How are you managing? Are you managing okay with the big virus and everything?
Oh yeah, well, I produced 3 graphic novels in the last year, which I wouldn't have been able to do before because I self-published. So Prince of Denmark Street, Finley Macbeth, The Midsummer Night's Dream. When I see you at the comic conventions, freebies are yours. And what comic conventions are you getting to?
We're not sure yet. We're still wondering what to do, because everything we were planning to do with Bluebeard was cancelled. We were meant to go to New York and Canada and things like that.
And that was 2020.
Yeah.
2020.
Yeah,
that was.
same here. Yeah.
That's kind of gone.
So we're thinking maybe the lakes and maybe Thought Bubble, but to be honest, we're still a bit on the fence about whether
we don't want to die.
Possible to go to big crowded events or not.
Well, are you double vaccinated yet?
John is.
I am. Yeah,
I'm not.
I am, but I think, given its relation to colds,
yeah,
I don't doubt that there'll be new variants, and I don't fancy dying in agony, or like, that old adage, if it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger. That's been revised.
Yes.
Now, if it doesn't kill you, it fucks you up for the rest of your fucking life. And I quite like life. You know what I mean? We've been very productive. And in all honesty, apart from the lack of author visits in schools and the lack of travel to conventions, our life's just much the same. We're missing swimming like crazy. We go running now, which is a lot less wet, and your muscles are less supported, but it's still pretty much the same us.
Yeah, this is what I'm appreciating, because a lot of my comic creator friends live alone or work alone, and as a couple, and obviously I've got Heather and myself here, we've really made things, you make things very normal for yourselves, because actually a lot of your life is here. And so yes, apart from the visiting and traveling, and of course I got comedy as well, which is another part of the traveling, those bits changed, but then the production that you could do at the desk and online, I've been doing a load of online stuff, and
sounds like you've made the most of it, man. That's really good.
Well, yeah, I mean, I started doing this podcast just in the last couple of weeks, when in fact I don't have to. I can go out now. But the comedy shows, I started doing online comedy shows, and have been, I stepped it up to be doing one of those every 2 weeks. And then I started this year doing open mics with my sock puppet theatre. And I've basically been doing the open mic circuit in a way that I'd not done for 15 years. And of course, that's all now winding up, and people are going back to live again.
You seem quite rejuvenated in that sense. Making 3 books is no small thing in a year.
And I know I couldn't have done it because I intended making a fourth one starting about October time. But by that time, online classes had really ramped up. I was as busy in October, November as I would be in a normal October, November. And of course, I didn't have any travel costs. So those months were just as profitable with school visits and gigs as they would be if I was traveling to Germany and Scotland and Ireland, which I was doing right up until February 2020.
Yeah.
We found a similar equation. It's not so much the travel costs, because ours were usually reimbursed, or always reimbursed, but it's the